The desperate call. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been in progress for 16 hours. Ambassador Theron of the Valorian Empire stood at the central podium, his forearms gesturing with increasing desperation as he displayed holographic images of devastation across the council chamber. World after world appeared in the projection, each one showing the same horrific pattern. Cities reduced to ash, populations decimated, defense fleets scattered like leaves before a storm. The Krillian invasion had been underway for 8 months, and the coalition of 37 species that called themselves the Galactic Council was losing badly. Theron's voice carried the weight of billions of lives as he spoke to the assembled representatives. The Krillians were not a species that negotiated or sought territory. They were a hive-mind entity that existed solely to consume and expand. Every world they conquered became a breeding ground for more soldiers. Every defeat the coalition suffered made the enemy stronger. The mathematics of the war were simple and terrifying. At the current rate of loss, the core worlds would fall within a year. After that, the entire galaxy would belong to the swarm. The council chamber was a masterpiece of architecture, built to inspire cooperation and unity among vastly different species. Today it felt like a tomb. Representatives from insectoid races sat beside mammalian ones. Energy beings floated near crystalline entities. All of them shared the same expression of fear and helplessness. They had thrown everything they had at the Krillians, fleets numbering in the thousands, weapons that could crack planets, strategic minds that had won conflicts spanning centuries. None of it mattered. The Krillians kept coming. High Chancellor Mordain called for proposals. The Zenthari suggested concentrating all remaining forces at the core worlds and abandoning the outer territories. The Forian Collective proposed biological warfare, though their own scientists admitted they had no weapon that could affect a hive mind. The Draxan Union recommended seeking a diplomatic solution, which was met with bitter laughter from several delegates. You could not negotiate with an entity that viewed all other life as food. The debate continued in circles, each proposal more desperate than the last. Then Theron spoke again and the chamber fell silent. There was one species they had not yet approached for military assistance. One civilization that had been granted observer status in the council, but had never been asked to contribute forces to any conflict. The humans of Earth. The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some delegates nodded thoughtfully. Others made sounds of dismissal or confusion. Humanity was barely 100 years into faster-than-light travel. Their technology was primitive compared to most council races. Their military doctrine was studied by xenoanthropologists as an example of a developing civilization, not by strategists seeking tactical advantage. But Theron had done his research. He had spent weeks reviewing every scrap of data the Council had collected about Earth since first contact. What he found both fascinated and disturbed him. Humanity was a species that had been at war with itself for its entire recorded history. While other civilizations had evolved past large-scale conflict within a few centuries of achieving industrialization, humans had turned warfare into an art form. They had developed thousands of ways to kill each other. They had created weapons of such devastating power that they could render their own world uninhabitable, and they had come close to using them multiple times. The Council database contained footage of human conflicts. Theron had watched battles from their 2 world wars, conflicts that had consumed entire continents and killed tens of millions. He had seen their tactical innovations, their strategic thinking, their absolute refusal to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. But what truly caught his attention were the classified files. Information that human governments had shared with the Council under strict confidentiality agreements. Details about military programs that operated in the shadows. Special operations units that conducted missions no government would acknowledge. Individuals who had been trained or had trained themselves to be the most efficient killers their species had ever produced. When Theron proposed requesting human military assistance, High Chancellor Mordain asked the obvious question. What could a primitive species possibly offer that 37 advanced civilizations could not provide? Theron's answer was simple and chilling. The humans could offer soldiers who understood fighting without rules. Warriors who had perfected the art of asymmetric warfare, operatives who could think like predators because at their core, humans still were predators. The Krillians fought with overwhelming numbers and biological efficiency, Perhaps what the coalition needed was an enemy that fought with cunning, creativity, and a willingness to do whatever victory required. The debate that followed was heated. The Peltari delegation argued that bringing humans into the war was beneath the dignity of advanced civilizations. The Novarian Concordat worried about the precedent it would set, giving military authority to a species barely out of its own planetary conflicts. But Ambassador Theron had allies. The Valorian Empire had lost 12 colony worlds to the Krillians. They were willing to try anything. The Xanthari warriors recognized the value of unpredictable tactics. The Crystalline Collective, despite having no concept of violence in their own culture, understood that sometimes survival required uncomfortable choices. After 20 hours of debate, the council voted. It was not unanimous, but it was decisive. They would send a formal request to Earth asking for military assistance. The message would be transmitted through official diplomatic channels with full transparency about the situation. Humanity would be offered a seat at the strategic planning table and full access to coalition resources and technology. In return, Earth would send whatever military forces they deemed appropriate to help turn the tide of the war. The vote was recorded, the message was drafted, and the council adjourned with a mixture of hope and apprehension. On Earth, the message arrived at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. It was forwarded immediately to the Security Council, which convened an emergency closed session. Representatives from every major nation gathered in a room designed to handle global crises. They read the Galactic Council's request in silence, each of them understanding the magnitude of what was being asked. This was not a peacekeeping mission or a humanitarian deployment. This was a request for soldiers to fight in an interstellar war against an enemy that had defeated dozens of species more advanced than humanity. The debate in the Security Council was different from the one that had taken place in the Galactic Council chamber. Human governments had been preparing for this possibility since first contact. They had contingency plans for various scenarios of galactic conflict, but no one had expected to be asked to contribute forces so soon or in such a desperate situation. The military advisors presented their analysis. If Earth sent conventional forces, army divisions, or naval battle groups, they would be outmatched by the technology and scale of the conflict. Human weapons were effective against human enemies, but they were designed for planetary warfare, not space battles against biological monstrosities. Then a representative from the United States made a proposal that changed the tone of the meeting. There was another option, an option that had been discussed in classified briefings but never seriously considered for deployment. Humanity had soldiers, yes, but it also had something else. It had individuals and units that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional military doctrine. Special operations forces that conducted missions in the shadows. Intelligence operatives trained in methods that violated every international treaty. And most controversially, it had prisoners. Individuals locked away in the deepest, most secure facilities on Earth because they were too dangerous to ever be released. The proposal was radical and disturbing. Instead of sending regular military units to fight in the galactic war, Earth would offer to send its most dangerous operatives. The soldiers who had been court-martialed for going too far. The special forces operators who had crossed lines that should never be crossed. The intelligence agents who had been disavowed by their own governments. And yes, even the criminals. The murderers and war criminals who possessed skills that made them valuable despite their crimes. These individuals would be given a choice: remain imprisoned for life or fight for humanity in a war that could determine the fate of the galaxy. The debate was fierce. Some representatives argued this was unconscionable, that sending criminals and disgraced soldiers would shame humanity in the eyes of the galaxy. Others pointed out that the galaxy was desperate enough to ask for help from a species they considered primitive. Clearly, they needed results more than they needed propriety. The military advisors supported the plan from a tactical standpoint. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were individuals who had proven themselves capable of operating in impossible situations. They understood asymmetric warfare. They could think creatively under pressure. And most importantly, they were willing to do things that regular soldiers could not or would not do. After 72 hours of debate, argument, and political maneuvering, Earth reached a decision. They would send operatives to fight in the galactic war, but not the kind of soldiers the Council was expecting. The response was drafted carefully, approved by every major government, and transmitted back to the Galactic Council. Earth would provide 2,000 combat operatives. These individuals would be drawn from special operations forces, intelligence agencies, and security detention facilities. They would be equipped with the best technology Earth could provide and supported by military advisors and logistics personnel. And they would be given full operational autonomy to conduct the war as they saw fit. The message included one final paragraph that would prove prophetic. It warned the Galactic Council that these operatives fought using methods that might be considered unconventional or even disturbing by Council standards. They were not trained to fight with honor or follow the established rules of warfare. They were trained to win by any means necessary. If the Council wanted soldiers who would follow protocol and maintain dignity in defeat, they should look elsewhere. If they wanted soldiers who could actually stop the Krillians, then Earth's operatives were the answer. The choice was theirs. When Ambassador Theron read Earth's response, he felt something he had not experienced in months. Hope mixed with unease. The Galactic Council met again to review the human offer. There was resistance from some delegates, concern about what kind of soldiers would require such warnings. But High Chancellor Mordain silenced the debate with a simple question. Did they want to win this war, or did they want to lose with dignity? The vote was taken. Earth's offer was accepted. 2,000 human operatives would be deployed to the front lines of the war against the Krillians. On Earth, the selection process began immediately. Military intelligence identified candidates from across the globe. Special Forces operators with records that included successful but controversial missions. Intelligence operatives who had operated in war zones using methods that blurred ethical lines. And from the secret detention facilities, prisoners who possessed skills that made them simultaneously valuable and terrifying. Each candidate was approached individually. Each was given the same choice: continue their current status or fight for humanity in a war among the stars. Almost everyone said yes. The selected operatives were brought to a classified military installation in the Nevada desert. They came from different backgrounds, different nations, different moral frameworks. What they shared was a capacity for violence that went beyond what normal military training could produce. Some had been born with it. Others had developed it through trauma or training. All of them had crossed lines that separated soldiers from something else. They were gathered together, 2,000 individuals who represented humanity's capacity for creative destruction, and they were told they would be Earth's representatives in a galactic war. The training period was brief. They were introduced to alien technology, though most of it was intuitive enough for experienced soldiers to master quickly. They were briefed on the Krillians, their tactics, their biology, their strengths and weaknesses. They were told about the coalition species they would be fighting alongside, and warned to avoid causing diplomatic incidents. The briefings were professional and thorough, but everyone involved knew the truth. These operatives were not being sent to follow coalition doctrine. They were being sent to do what humans did best: adapt, improvise, and overcome through any means available. The transport ships were loaded with equipment that made coalition observers uncomfortable. Human weapons were primitive by galactic standards, but they were effective in ways that energy weapons were not. Explosives that could be shaped and directed. Chemical agents that could create area denial zones. Kinetic weapons that were simple, reliable, and devastating at close range. The operatives also brought psychological warfare equipment, surveillance technology, and interrogation tools. They were preparing to fight a different kind of war than the coalition had been waging. As the transport ships prepared to depart Earth, the operatives gathered for a final briefing. They were addressed by a general who had spent his career in special operations. He told them they were about to face an enemy that had defeated civilizations thousands of years more advanced than humanity. He told them the galaxy was watching to see what humans could contribute to this war. And he told them something that every person in that room already knew. They were not being sent as heroes. They were being sent as weapons. The galaxy had asked for soldiers, and humanity was sending the monsters it feared most. Their job was to prove that sometimes monsters were exactly what you needed. The ships launched from Earth carrying 2,000 individuals who had been criminals, outcasts, and nightmares. Now they were going to be humanity's representatives in a galactic war. The coalition had asked for help. They were about to discover what human help actually meant. Monsters unleashed. The Coalition command station orbiting the planet. Threshold 9 was a structure built to coordinate the defense of an entire sector. It housed military personnel from 17 different species, commanded fleets of hundreds of warships, and processed tactical data from 1,000 battlefronts simultaneously. When the human transport ships arrived, they were met with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Admiral Cresseth of the Valorian Empire had fought the Krillians for 8 months without a single significant victory. He was not expecting much from the primitive species that had just joined the war. The docking procedures were standard, but what emerged from the human ships was anything but. Cresseth had reviewed files on human military structure. He expected to see uniformed soldiers marching in formation, officers with clear chains of command, the disciplined appearance of a professional fighting force. Instead, he watched as 2,000 humans disembarked with the casual efficiency of predators entering new territory. They wore uniforms, but each one was slightly different, modified or customized in ways that spoke of individual preference rather than regulation. They moved in small groups rather than formal units, and they watched everything with eyes that missed nothing. The human commander was a woman named Colonel Sarah Venn. She had spent 20 years in special operations before being recruited for this mission. Her record included operations in 14 countries, most of which were still classified decades after they occurred. She met Admiral Cresseth in the station's command center and saluted with professional courtesy. Cresseth returned the gesture, his forearms moving in the traditional Valorian acknowledgement of respect between warriors. Then he asked the question that had been troubling him since Earth's response arrived. What kind of soldiers had humanity actually sent? Venn's answer was direct and unflinching. Earth had sent operatives who specialized in unconventional warfare. Some were current special forces with experience in counterterrorism and guerrilla operations. Others were intelligence operatives skilled in sabotage and psychological warfare. And yes, some were individuals who had been imprisoned for various offenses but possessed skills that made them valuable in this context. All of them had volunteered for this mission. All of them understood they were humanity's response to a desperate situation, and all of them were ready to fight a war that could not be won through conventional means. Cresseth led Venn to the tactical display showing the current situation in the Threshold sector. 12 planets were under Krillian occupation. Coalition forces held defensive positions around another 8 worlds, but those defenses were eroding. The Krillians attacked in waves that never stopped, wearing down defenders through sheer persistence. Coalition doctrine emphasized holding strong points and conducting organized retreats when positions became untenable. It was a strategy designed to preserve forces and buy time. It was also a strategy that was slowly losing the war. Venn studied the display for several minutes without speaking. Then she asked questions that revealed a different way of thinking about the conflict. Where did the Krillians stage their forces before attacks? How did they communicate across their hive mind network? What happened to their coordination when communication nodes were destroyed? Did they have supply lines or did they consume local resources? What was their response time when faced with unexpected threats? Cresseth answered what he could, but many of her questions touched on aspects of Krillian operations that Coalition intelligence had never prioritized. They had been focused on stopping the attacks, not on understanding the underlying systems that made those attacks possible. The human operatives were given quarters in a section of the station normally reserved for visiting dignitaries. They were offered orientation briefings and integration training with Coalition forces. Most of them declined. Instead, they spent their time reviewing intelligence data, studying Krillian biology and tactics, and planning operations that made Coalition officers deeply uncomfortable. Within 48 hours of arrival, Venn presented a proposal to Admiral Cresseth that would either change the course of the war or prove that humanity had no business being involved in galactic conflicts. The plan was simple in concept but radical in execution. Instead of defending planets against Krillian attacks, human operatives would conduct offensive raids into occupied territory. They would target Krillian command nodes, breeding facilities, and staging areas. They would use guerrilla tactics to disrupt enemy operations and force the Krillians to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive ones. Most controversially, they would operate in small teams with minimal support, relying on speed and surprise rather than firepower and numbers. It was the opposite of everything Coalition military doctrine recommended. Cresseth's initial response was to reject the plan entirely. Sending small teams into Krillian-occupied territory was suicide. The hive mind would detect them immediately, and overwhelmed them with numbers. Coalition forces had tried similar operations early in the war, and the results had been disastrous. But Ven countered every objection with specific tactical proposals. Human operatives would use stealth technology and biological camouflage to avoid detection. They would strike targets during the brief windows when Krillian hive communication was disrupted by their own attack waves. They would extract before the enemy could coordinate a response, and if extraction was not possible, they would adapt and survive using whatever resources were available. The debate continued for hours. Other coalition commanders joined the discussion, most of them opposing the human plan. A Xanthari general argued that such tactics were dishonorable and beneath civilized species. A Peltari strategist calculated the probable casualty rates and declared the entire operation a waste of resources. But Ambassador Theron, who had advocated for bringing humans into the war, supported Ven's proposal. The coalition had tried fighting this war with honor and conventional tactics for 8 months. They had lost consistently. Perhaps it was time to try something different, even if that something was uncomfortable. Admiral Cresseth made his decision based on pragmatism rather than optimism. The coalition was losing battles across multiple sectors. If the humans wanted to try their unconventional approach, he would give them one opportunity. They could conduct a single raid against a target of their choosing. If they succeeded, he would consider expanding their operational authority. If they failed, humanity's contribution to the war would be reassigned to conventional defensive duties where they could be properly supervised. Ven agreed to the terms immediately. She already had a target selected. The planet designated Harvest 7 had fallen to the Krillians 6 weeks earlier. It had been an agricultural world supporting a population of 4 million. The Krillians had consumed the population within days and converted the entire planet into a breeding facility. Coalition intelligence estimated there were now over 20 million Krillian warriors on Harvest 7, with more being spawned every day. It was one of the most heavily defended enemy positions in the sector. The coalition had written it off as unrecoverable. Ven chose it as humanity's first target. The human operatives selected for the raid numbered just 60 individuals. They were divided into 6 teams of 10, each with a specific objective. 3 teams would target breeding complexes in different regions of the planet. 2 teams would strike Krillian communication nodes. 1 team would conduct reconnaissance and gather intelligence on enemy operations. They would deploy using small, stealth shuttles, operate for 72 hours, and extract from predetermined locations. Coalition forces would provide orbital support only in extreme emergencies. Otherwise, the humans would be on their own, deep in enemy territory. The operation launched from Threshold 9 station at midnight ship time. Cresseth watched from the command center as the stealth shuttles departed, their signatures barely visible on coalition sensors. Beside him stood several other commanders who had come to observe what they expected to be a demonstration of human foolishness. Theron was also present, his expression unreadable. They settled in to wait. The raid would take at least 18 hours before the first results became apparent. Until then, all they could do was watch the tactical displays and wonder what kind of soldiers humanity had actually sent to fight this war. The first indication that something was happening came 14 hours into the operation. A Krillian breeding complex in the southern hemisphere of Harvest 7 suddenly went dark on coalition sensors. The massive biological structure that had been spawning thousands of warriors simply ceased functioning. 2 hours later, a second breeding complex suffered the same fate. Then a communication node went offline, followed by another. Across the planet, Krillian operations were being disrupted in ways that seemed impossible. Coalition intelligence reported increased enemy activity, warriors moving erratically as if the hive mind was experiencing confusion and communication breakdowns. At the 18-hour mark, the first human team called for extraction. Their stealth shuttle descended through atmosphere under heavy jamming, landed for 90 seconds, and departed with all team members recovered. Over the next 6 hours, the other 5 teams extracted successfully. When the last shuttle docked with Threshold 9 station, Cresseth ordered an immediate assessment of the raid's results. What he learned changed his understanding of what human soldiers were capable of achieving. The three teams targeting breeding complexes had not simply destroyed their objectives. They had infiltrated the massive biological structures using techniques that coalition forces had never considered. They had identified vulnerable points in the Krillian biological architecture and introduced chemical agents that caused cascading failures throughout the facilities. Millions of developing Krillian warriors had died in their spawning chambers. The breeding complexes themselves were now toxic zones that the Krillians would have to abandon or spend months decontaminating. The teams hitting communication nodes had been equally effective. Instead of destroying the nodes which the Krillians could rebuild, they had corrupted them. They had introduced false signals and contradictory commands into the hive mind network. Krillian warriors across the planet had received orders that conflicted with their biological imperatives, causing confusion and dysfunction that would take weeks to fully resolve. The reconnaissance team had mapped enemy positions and identified 12 additional high-value targets for future operations. But what disturbed Cressith most was the methods the humans had employed. When he reviewed the after-action reports and saw the operational recordings, he witnessed tactics that no coalition force would have used. The humans had disguised themselves using biological material harvested from dead Krillians. They had moved through enemy territory by exploiting gaps in hive mind perception that coalition scientists had never identified. They had killed sentries, using weapons and techniques that were silent, brutal, and horrifyingly effective. They had operated for 72 hours deep in enemy territory, not by avoiding the Krillians but by thinking like them, moving like them, becoming temporary predators in an environment designed for predators. The casualty report showed 4 humans wounded, none killed. The mission success rate was 100% across all objectives, and the psychological impact on Krillian operations in the sector was already becoming apparent. Enemy forces that had been preparing for offensive operations were now consolidating defensively. Attack waves that had been hitting coalition positions daily had stopped. The hive mind was confused, uncertain, experiencing something it had never encountered before. Fear of an enemy that struck from nowhere and disappeared before retaliation was possible. Admiral Cressith called Colonel Venn to his office for a private conversation. He needed to understand what kind of soldiers could achieve such results. Venn's explanation was characteristically direct. The operatives humanity had sent were not trained to fight honorable battles or follow established military doctrine. They were trained to identify enemy vulnerabilities and exploit them without hesitation or remorse. Many of them had spent years operating in environments where conventional tactics meant death. They had learned to adapt, to think creatively, to use whatever advantages were available regardless of how other species might judge those methods. Cressith asked the question that had been troubling him since reviewing the raid recordings. Were all human soldiers capable of such ruthlessness? Venn's answer was complex. Most human military personnel were conventional soldiers who fought with discipline and honor. They followed rules of engagement and international laws governing warfare. But humanity also produced individuals who operated beyond those constraints. Some volunteered for it, seeking the challenge of special operations. Others were identified through aptitude and trained specifically for unconventional warfare. And some, the ones that humanity locked away in its deepest prisons, were simply born with a capacity for violence that exceeded normal parameters. The operatives on this station represented all 3 categories. The Valorian admiral made his decision. The humans had proven their effectiveness. They would be given expanded operational authority to conduct raids throughout the sector. Coalition intelligence would provide targeting information and logistical support. Human teams would have complete tactical autonomy to plan and execute missions as they saw fit. And other coalition commanders would be strongly encouraged to integrate human operatives into their sectors as well. The war against the Krillians was about to change dramatically. Over the following weeks, human teams conducted operations across a dozen worlds. Each raid was different, adapted to specific targets and situations. They destroyed breeding facilities using biological warfare agents developed from captured Krillian genetic material. They sabotaged communication networks in ways that caused the hive mind to turn on itself. They conducted psychological operations that exploited newly discovered vulnerabilities in Krillian collective consciousness. And they killed. They killed with efficiency and creativity that made coalition observers deeply uncomfortable. The results were undeniable. Krillian advance across multiple sectors had stalled. Worlds that had been days from falling were suddenly stable. Enemy forces that had been coordinated and relentless were now reactive and uncertain. For the first time in 8 months, the coalition was not losing ground. They were not winning yet, but they had stopped the bleeding. And it was all because of 2,000 human operatives who fought a war that had nothing to do with honor or dignity, and everything to do with survival. But success came with uncomfortable questions. Coalition soldiers who fought alongside humans reported disturbing incidents. Prisoners taken by human teams were interrogated using techniques that violated multiple interstellar conventions. Enemy wounded were not given medical assistance but were instead eliminated to prevent them from rejoining the hive mind. Captured Krillian biological material was used in experiments that coalition ethics boards would never have approved. The humans were winning battles, but they were doing it by becoming something that made their allies afraid. Ambassador Theron found himself in an impossible position. He had advocated for bringing humans into the war. Their effectiveness was beyond question. But he was receiving reports from multiple coalition members expressing concern about human methods. Some species found human tactics barbaric. Others worried about what would happen when the war ended. And these human operatives were no longer pointed at an enemy everyone agreed needed to be destroyed. The question that kept Theron awake during his rest cycles was simple and terrifying. Had they defeated one monster by unleashing another? The Krillians began adapting to human tactics. The hive mind learned to anticipate raids and set traps. They altered their communication protocols to be more resistant to sabotage. They deployed new warrior variants specifically designed to counter human stealth techniques. But the humans adapted faster. They changed tactics with every operation, never using the same approach twice. They exploited Krillian adaptations to create new vulnerabilities. They operated with a flexibility that the hive mind, for all its collective intelligence, could not match. 3 months after the first human raid, Admiral Cresseth received intelligence that would determine the next phase of the war. Coalition scouts had located the Krillian primary hive node, a massive biological structure on a planet designated Nexus Prime. This was the central coordination point for Krillian operations across dozens of sectors. Destroying it would not eliminate the Krillian threat, but it would cripple their ability to coordinate large-scale operations for months or possibly years. It was the most heavily defended location in Krillian space. Attacking it with conventional forces would require a fleet of thousands and would result in catastrophic casualties even if successful. Colonel Venn proposed an alternative. A strike team of 100 human operatives could infiltrate Nexus Prime using newly developed stealth technology. They would plant specialized explosives at critical points throughout the hive node structure. The resulting detonation would collapse the entire facility and eliminate the primary coordination capability of the Krillian hive mind. The operation would be one way. Extraction was possible but unlikely. Every operative who volunteered would be told explicitly that they were probably going to die on that planet. When Venn presented the mission to her people, she expected volunteers to be scarce. This was not a raid with planned extraction. This was a suicide mission with a slim possibility of survival. Every human operative on the station volunteered. All 2,000 of them wanted to be part of the strike team. Venn had to conduct a selection process to narrow the number down to 100. The criteria were simple: who had the best chance of completing the mission regardless of personal survival. The strike team launched toward Nexus Prime with the full support of the coalition fleet. They would have one advantage the Krillians would not anticipate. The humans were not planning to survive. They were planning to win. Every tactical decision was made with that understanding. They would take risks no rational soldier would take. They would push deeper into enemy territory than any sane person would venture. They would complete the mission because failure was not an option and survival was not a priority. The mission lasted 6 days. Coalition forces monitored what they could from long-range sensors, but most of the operation occurred beyond their ability to observe. What they knew was that the human team penetrated Krillian defenses that should have been impenetrable. They fought through enemy forces that outnumbered them thousands to one. They reached the central hive node and planted their explosives with precision that suggested they had been preparing for this exact mission their entire lives. And then they triggered the detonation that would destroy the primary coordination point of the Krillian invasion. The explosion was visible from orbit. The hive node structure collapsed, taking with it the Krillian command and control capabilities that had made their invasion so effective. Across dozens of sectors, Krillian forces suddenly lost coordination. Attack waves fell apart. Strategic movements became random and ineffective. The hive mind was not destroyed, but it was crippled in ways that would take years to fully recover from. The galaxy had just witnessed the turning point of the war. Of the 100 humans who went to Nexus Prime, 43 survived. They extracted using captured Krillian vessels, fighting their way through enemy forces that were confused and leaderless. When they returned to Coalition space, they were greeted as heroes. Admiral Cresseth himself met them at the docking bay, performing the highest Valorian honor salute. The Galactic Council declared them saviors of civilization. Medals and commendations were prepared. Humanity's contribution to the war was recognized across every Council species. But Colonel Venn stood in the command center looking at the casualty reports and felt something different than triumph. 57 humans had died on Nexus Prime. 2,000 had come to fight this war. 423 had died in operations across a dozen sectors. They had won battles and turned the tide of the war. They had saved billions of lives, and they had done it by being exactly what Earth had warned the galaxy they would be. Not soldiers fighting with honor, not heroes seeking glory, but monsters unleashed to fight other monsters. The war would continue for months, possibly years. The Krillians were wounded but not defeated, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Coalition would win because humanity had sent operatives who understood that some wars could not be won cleanly. Some enemies could not be defeated with honor. Sometimes survival required becoming the thing that nightmares were made of. The galaxy had asked for soldiers. Humanity had sent the monsters it feared most, and those monsters had saved them all.